A slip of the tongue. The entire room of 18 students in Professor Longica's conditional lexology class stared upward with open mouths, afraid that if they sneezed wrong, the 200-gallon aquarium that was currently stuck to the ceiling would come crashing down, flinging the tiny orange-tailed dream-eaters into their midst. Professor Sebastian Longicas reached over to his 80s-style boombox that sat on the front of his desk where he was currently leaning. He hit the big black button with his thumb, stopping the music that had been blaring into the room, which had until moments before been supplying the second-year student Isabella with the backbeat to help with the spell. He let the students ponder the problem, while he adjusted his tweed jacket. "Would anyone like to educate the class on what went wrong with Isabella's spell?" he asked in a calm voice. A few eyes darted his way, but quickly returned to the aquarium hanging above them. The orange and black striped fish swimming in the tank were from a river in the realm of harmony, and had the unfortunate ability to cause nightmares for months on end if they happened to bite unprotected flesh. "Professor," said Deshawn, gesturing towards the tank, "shouldn't you, I don't know, provide for the safety of your students by dealing with that? This is a wonderful time to remind you that with magic, safety is not guaranteed and highly likely to get you killed if you're not careful. Once again, who can tell me what went wrong with the spell?" When no one answered, he added, "Figuring that out will help you understand how to fix this little problem." He could see them starting to work through what Isabella had said. The initial shock of the tank rising through the middle of the class and slamming against the ceiling, spilling water as it impacted, was starting to wear off. Isabella raised her hand and then lowered it. "I think I said something like," she started, bobbing her head in remembrance of the beat, "in that tank, which is pretty fly, the fish are mean but would look better if they were the color of the sky." Sebastian could see the spark of understanding on her brow. A warmth and excitement at her realization was rising up through his midsection, bringing a smile, but he tempered it as not to distract Isabella. He could speak for hours about the dangers of improper word use in lexology, but a single and mostly benign mistake like Isabella's would save future lives if they incorporated the lesson he was trying to impart. "I guess," said Isabella as she played with a loose curl that hung down from her forehead, "I used the slang word fly, which along with the rhyming word sky might have confused the spell." "Exactly," said Sebastian, drumming on the desk in excitement. "Great job, Isabella. Remember, words are instructions for the mind. They're not just the word that you find in the dictionary, they have the meaning contained in your mind, for good or bad. You have to be careful on how you use them. Had you grown up in the 80s, then using fly might have been appropriate because your mind would have translated the word as a positive adjective, not a verb. Slang homonyms, these are the parts of lexology that are tricky. But what about the tank? Is it just going to stay up there all day?" asked Deshawn. "Only as long as Isabella's spell holds. Given the power that she gave it, the tank could be up there a couple hours or only another few seconds," he said. The entire class took a step backwards. "Now would anyone like to bring it down with all the water and fish still inside?" He paused. "Isabella, want to give it a shot?" "I would, Professor Longicas, but I'm afraid I'll screw it up again." He sensed wavering indecision. Magic was tricky, and lexology only more so because it involved culture and language more than most other studies. He didn't want to destroy her confidence while trying to educate an important lesson, but if she didn't solve the problem she created, the mistake would linger. "I believe in you, Isabella," he said, leaning over and pressing the button on the boombox. The beat returned, blaring out of the round speakers. She swallowed, looking apprehensively at the tank. She tried to sway with the beat, but he could see the previous mistake clouding her mind. A brief attempt to begin was swallowed back. Isabella stared at the floor, her cheeks growing rosy with embarrassment. Sensing he needed to offer encouragement, Sebastian rocked on his feet, clapping his hands to the beat, which was taken up by the class. The corners of a few lips curled upward, but they were still too tense to enjoy the moment. "My name is Professor Longicas, and this is my course. I teach how to use magic with words we enforce. There's a tank in the air from the ceiling we wish to untether. He gestured towards Isabella, who had been mouthing along with him. "Come down to the ground as light as a feather," she said. "Good," he said, continuing to clap to the beat. "Now say it again but with phase." Her eyes sparked with understanding. She nodded more emphatically, stomping her foot to the beat of the music. "My name is Isabella Gonzalez, and I'm in your course." I screwed up my words, which is a mistake I do not endorse. This tank is not a bird, even as we all clap together. Come down to the ground as light as a feather. The tank wobbled against the ceiling, splashing water onto the desks and floor. Isabella stared intently at the tank. It wasn't enough to get the words right or add the right amount of phase, the raw stuff of magic, but she had to believe in herself. When the aquarium started moving gently to the floor, Sebastian breathed a sigh of relief along with the rest of the class, though his was less about the problem being solved, and more about the effect on Isabella. She clapped her hands with excitement when it settled gently to the ground. He gave her a thumbs up as the rest of the class crowded around and patted her on the back. A bell rang and everyone grabbed their backpacks and notebooks and started filing out of the room, the near danger already forgotten. "Great class, everyone," said Sebastian, looking up from his papers. Isabella came up to his desk at the front. "Thank you, Professor Longacres. I learned more in this one class than I have all semester. Are you going to take over for Professor Chopra? He makes me nervous every time I try to use lexology." Lexology is a dangerous technique to use even for the experienced, so his caution is warranted. We're essentially making up spells on the fly which can result in many unexpected consequences, so please understand Professor Chopra means well when he's trying to imbue you with care. "Then why did you have us lifting his fish tank and all that?" she asked. "Well, maybe I saw that the class could use a little shaking up. Everyone was a little too cautious, you might say." She nodded. "I wish you were going to be here for more than one class." "I'm just filling in for him until he gets back, which will be soon," he said. "Is he all right? Did something happen?" "Nothing at all," said Sebastian with a wry grin. "But professors are people too and have things come up from time to time." Isabella's face brightened. "Thank you, Professor. I hope to be able to take one of your classes next year. I had a lot of fun." "Great," he said with a wink as she hurried out of the room to her next lesson. Sebastian was cleaning up his notes from the desk, humming along to the beat, when the last student left the room and closed the door a little too firmly. The glass in the aquarium shattered, sending a wave of water splashing outward. He leapt onto the desk as the tiny fish flopped around the floor. "Merlin's balls," he said from his perch. The impacts must have put a hairline crack in the glass that finally had succumbed to the pressure. He was glad that it waited until Isabella had left before it broke, but now he had a giant mess to clean. Sebastian checked his watch. The faculty meeting was in an hour, plenty of time to clean up. He slipped out, hurrying to a supply closet where he found a single big bucket, filled it with water before bringing it back to the classroom, where dozens of tiny fish were jawing emptily at the air trying to breathe. "Don't worry, my little friends, I'll get your fins wet soon." Using a soggy notebook that had been left on the floor and the pointer that Professor Chopra used to tap on the chalkboard, Sebastian scooped up the dream eaters and plopped them into the bucket of water, being careful not to let them touch his skin. "Sorry, you'll have to be cozy buddies until I can get you a replacement tank." With the fish safely in their buckets, Sebastian eyed the quarter-inch of water across the floor that had bits of broken glass floating on it. After a second visit to the supply closet, he spent the next 20 minutes mopping up the floor and cleaning up the glass. The option to use magic for fixing the mess had been tempting, but it was quicker in this instance to use a mop. It was only as he was picking up the last few pieces that he remembered he'd left his tray of homemade cupcakes beneath the desk near Professor Chopra's slippers. After placing the footwear on the desk to dry, he addressed the destruction of his baked goods. The lower quarter of the cardboard box was soggy. He had to lift it from the bottom to move it to the top of the desk. The inside was as bad as he feared. The chocolate fudge cupcakes covered in icing with the Arcanium hall design meticulously drawn with white powdered sugar had soaked up the aquarium water, warping the book on a gear patterns. He recalled a bakery up the street from Arcanium Hall called the Philosopher's Scone. If he hurried, he could pick up a new batch of treats in time for the faculty meeting, but the packed conditions in the bucket made him worried that they wouldn't survive their brief sequestration. He hated the idea of telling Professor Chopra that he'd killed some of his prize dream eaters while subbing for his class. There were probably more appropriate spells for the situation, but with his mind filled with the rhythms of lexology, he muttered over the bucket while imbuing his words with phase. Water, water in this bucket. Provide life for my fin friends and let no one chuck it. In here will be much air for your gills. Professor Longikas paused at the final line. The spell would probably be fine as he'd cast it, giving the water the extra oxygen required to keep the dream eaters alive until he could return with a larger tank, but he could hear Professor Chopra's complaints already if someone came in and disturbed the bucket. And should you feel danger, then give 'em a scare with your fins in the air. It wasn't the most elegant solution, but under the circumstances and the strained schedule, it would have to do. Sebastian threw his carryall over his shoulder, locked the door to the classroom to keep the curious from disturbing the fish, and hurried towards the front of Arcanium. The academy was an enormous medieval-style castle, which meant it wasn't made for easily getting around. The awkward spaces were often filled with shelves of books, as the school taught the magic of books and knowledge. Students smiled and greeted him as he hurried past. "Hey, Professor." A student with big headphones on his head, bobbing his head to the music playing, stepped into his path. Sebastian slowed down as he pulled the headphones down around his neck. "Hey Tristan, what can I do for you?" The second-year student dug into the backpack, producing a thumb drive. "I made this mixtape for you." "Well, obviously it's not a tape, but the discussion we had in the Magic of Words class inspired me to make one. I thought you might like it." "That's terrific," said Sebastian, tucking it into his inside pocket. "I can't wait to listen. I hope it's filled with new and interesting music that I haven't heard before." Tristan winked and held out his fist for a bump, which Sebastian obliged. "You know it. It's so fade." Tristan stared at his shoes. "Do you think you could help me with my runic calligraphy study? I'm struggling with the penmanship. My handwriting sucks." "Absolutely," said Sebastian, putting his hand on Tristan's shoulder. "And thank you for asking for help." He resisted the urge to look at his watch. "Do you need anything else? We can schedule some work sessions for later this week, if that's acceptable." "Yeah, totally. Thanks, Professor." Tristan slipped his headphones back on and wandered to a little cubby surrounded by bookshelves. Sebastian hurried down the long hallway that led to the drawbridge. He was halfway there when a woman with steel grey hair wrapped into a braid wheeled out of a doorway. "Are you going to be late to the faculty meeting again?" asked Professor Marley from her wheelchair. "Not if I can help it, Joanne," he said, laughing as he shifted into a jog. "You need to get your act together, Sebastian. You spend too much time trying to please the students," she called after him sternly. He ran backwards and held his arms up. "We're here for their benefit." He didn't bother seeing her reaction because he knew what it would be, one of unyielding disappointment. As the newest professor on the staff, he often felt like the others still saw him as the gangly student that had nearly blown up the Tower of Letters in his 4th year. Sebastian slowed his pace when he crossed the drawbridge onto a modern city street. Vehicles blared their horns, while tourists gawked at the Arcanium building, taking selfies or buying trinkets from the vendors that usually worked near the entrance. He inhaled deeply, smiling at tourists who pointed at him as he hurried past. After a few decades of doing research on spells hidden in popular works of fiction, he'd been delighted when Patron Gray had invited him to teach at Arcanium. The Philosopher's Scone had an iced outline of Voltaire on the big sign, his mane of curly locks displayed as a wave of white swirls. The line was rather long when he stepped inside, pushing against the door. The tables were filled with happy customers hungrily shoving baked treats into their mouths. Sebastian hummed to the music playing lightly over the speakers, while he studied the menu on the wall behind the counter. He had to return soon, but it was his turn to bring the snacks, and there was nothing more disappointing than having to endure the inane discussions without something to munch on. Professor Gill usually went on about getting better reagents for the alchemical ink stores. Professor Mooney tried to tell everyone there was a ghost that hung out near the biblioscribe, and Professor Marley requested to reinstitute the arcane punishments that had been around in her days, but in his eyes did little more than make the students afraid to make mistakes, which was no way to learn magic. "How may I help you?" He'd been so busy thinking about past meetings, he'd forgotten to settle on his order. The woman behind the counter had a mop of frizzy red hair and a scattering of freckles on her cheeks and nose. "Oh, I seem to have been daydreaming," he said with a chuckle. "Do you have a box of something to make a group of professors less cantankerous?" The woman behind the counter smiled and extended her arm towards a menu on the side. "I do have some baked goods specially formulated with alchemical agents. The effects are listed next to the item. For example, the whole truth donut holes help make one a little more forthcoming." She wrinkled her nose, eyes sparkling with mirth. "But that doesn't sound like a wise choice for a group of professors." "Arcanium, right?" "The very one," he said, finding himself grinning. "Alchemist?" "Yeah," she said, leaning on the counter with her head tilted. "I did the corporate thing for a while, but sitting in boring strategy meetings that never went anywhere broke my soul. So I opened up this shop last year. I feel amiss that I haven't stopped in before. I had an unfortunate aquarium accident that took out my homemade cupcakes. I'd made little Arcanium badges on the top, with a powdered sugar sieve. But they didn't survive Lexology class, thus here I am." She drummed on the table with her tongue tapping on her teeth. "I would recommend the 100 Halls assortment box. It has a mix of hall badges on the tops. There might only be 1 or 2 Arcanium, but I can promise you they taste delicious, no matter what the badge." "I'll take it. Better yet, give me 2 dozen," he said. "It'll be fun to see which halls they want to eat. Suss out a little school rivalry through the divination of baked goods." She gathered the boxes from the glass cabinets, and he noticed what time it was as he was handing over the bills. "Keep the change," he told her as he hurried out clutching 2 boxes of cupcakes. "Good luck with your meeting," she called after, prompting a round of chuckles from the people waiting in line. Sebastian sprinted across the crosswalk, narrowly avoiding a big SUV that hadn't seen, because he was too busy chastising himself for not getting the woman's name. A reason to make a return visit, he told himself as he jogged across the drawbridge. The warding at the entrance felt like tiny spiderwebs kissing his skin before it disappeared, recognizing his presence due to the enchanted Arcanium pin on his lapel. He ran the length of the hall until he reached the facility meeting room. "You're late," said Professor Marley as soon as he burst inside. "As expected." "I promise the delay will be quite delicious," he said as the other professors eyed the boxes in his arms. "I had a mishap with my homemade cupcakes, but I think mistakes breed opportunity." "Mistakes are a sign of laziness," said Professor Marley as she reached towards the first box, which had been opened as soon as it hit the table. "No Semyon today?" asked Sebastian as he took his spot near the middle of the table between Professor Mooney and the empty chair where Chopra normally sat. "Patron Gray is busy with some meeting between the top halls," said Professor Marley as she took a second bite of her Arcanium cupcake. Sebastian surveyed the remaining treats, choosing an order of Honorable Alchemist's chocolate with a pink rose surrounded by a sunburst. After a lot of quiet murmuring, the meeting began with a long speech from Professor Marley about keeping the students from experimenting too much, that they should stick to the curriculum for safety's sake. "Before we hit the scheduled items, does anyone have anything to bring up?" asked Professor Marley. "There was another sighting." "That's great, Mooney, but until someone else sees this ghost, I think we should table the item," said Professor Marley. "But Joanne." "Anyone else?" she asked. Sebastian cleared his throat. I was hoping we could revive the talent show. It's a chance for students to showcase what they're proud of. You want them to have an easy win, said Professor Marley, scowling. I suppose that's a way to put it. He noticed a tiny piece of pink icing on his finger and sucked it off. When they leave the hall, they'll be making choices about their lives. Why not give them a chance to try something of their own making, rather than what we tell them to do? Need I remind you that in the last year of the talent show, one of the third years, a Davis Niles had a group of monkeys, a ladder and a bathtub on stage, and when he tried some bit of advanced Mendon-C, he disappeared and was never seen again. Yes, of course magic is dangerous, but so is the world. When you join the halls, the hazards are understood, said Sebastian. We're not coterie, said Professor Marley. They lose a quarter of their students by the end of their 5 years. Yet more sign up to join their hall every year than any other, he replied. Professor Marley drummed her fingers on the table as she stared back. I will bring it up when Patron Gray when he returns, but I can assure you that he will not budge on this matter. Fair enough, he said, smiling, that's all I ask. The rest of the meeting was mundane discussions around the trivialities of running a magical academy. Having the students live on the premises meant they had to deal with more than the classroom issues. It was hard enough to be that age, but adding magic and the drama of so many personalities could get a bit messy. After the meeting wrapped up, Sebastian was readying to leave when Professor Marley asked him to stay. Yes, he said, checking as the others left. What do you need? Her mouth shifted to the side with a little embarrassment. I'm supposed to cover Alan's lexology class with the first years, but I really need to get home to check on. Of course I would be happy to take the spot, he said. Are you sure? I would ask one of the other professors, but everyone has classes at that time and I know you love the first years, she said. I love all the years, they each have their own delightful opportunities. She rolled her eyes. Of course you would say that. But it's true. Either way, thank you. My pleasure. Professor Marley rolled out of the facility room, leaving him alone. He'd planned on taking the time to grade papers, but fitting another class in wouldn't be the end of him. As he left the room, he noted that the only 2 cupcakes left in the boxes had the coterie of Major's obelisk with wings design. Some rivalries never died, even amongst the professors. The introduction to lexology class wasn't as thrilling as the earlier one with the second years. They were new enough to magic that he kept it to the basics, and only introduced the idea of using music and poetry to help improve outputs at the end of class. He was rewarded with a few twinkling eyes as they shuffled out of the room. With a short gap before his next class, Sebastian hurried to his office, which was near the Tower of Letters. He touched the little patch of old burn before entering his private quarters. His office could use some organization, but he never found he had the time. As the newest professor, he was continually having to pick up the classes that the others couldn't make, or was given extra tasks by Patron Gray. The couch was covered in old tomes about the magical artifacts of the ancient world. One of those tasks from his patron was about trying to find where Alexander the Great's plumed helmet might have disappeared to after his death. Sebastian thought the trail was far too cold, but his patron was convinced that it had appeared a few decades ago and was trying to track it down. The rest of the room was equally messy. An enchanted lyre that he'd picked up on a trip to Mykonos lay in the corner, waiting for him to have a free moment. He'd been trying to recreate some of the old spells from that time period, but they were often put to music, which made the spells trickier than normal. Sebastian shoved the thumb drive into his laptop, pulled up the mixtape, and hit play before tackling the stack of papers that he was behind on grading. He barely got through the first quarter inch before he had to hurry to a special lecture on vitamin C and the efficiency of truth that he'd promised the 4th and 5th years in main auditorium. Along the way he passed Tristan and held up his fist for a bump. Loving the mixtape. So fade, said Tristan, spinning around as he hurried to his late afternoon class. Sebastian slipped into the auditorium as the bell sounded. He was greeted with smiles and more seats filled than expected. "I see we have some of our newer Arcanium students here," he said, prompting a few to rise from their seats, "but please stay. I have room for all that want to learn." The next hour and a half was one of spirited discussion and a few bouts of laughter, as a fifth year tried to stand on a piece of string stretched between two chairs, reinforced with vitamin C, only to learn why truth was subjective and prone to erroneous beliefs. When his faith faltered, so too did the string, and he came crashing down on the auditorium floor. As the lecture finished up, Sebastian realized he was late again. He grabbed his carryall and hurried out of Arcanium, heading straight to the nearby parking garage to drive his 20-year-old Toyota Magelight to the Fifth Ward. He pulled up in the parking lot of Golden Willow Hospital to find Professor Chopra standing outside the emergency room. Sebastian put the car in park and hurried around to open the door for Professor Chopra, who limped to the vehicle and climbed into the passenger seat. "Everything okay, Alan?" A weary-looking Professor Chopra sighed and said, "No one knows what happened, right?" "Nope." "Good," said Alan, leaning his head against the rest. "I would be very embarrassed if the students or other professors knew I bungled that simple lexology spell. You might consider that by being honest about your mistakes, not only will the students respect you more, but it would provide a valuable lesson," said Sebastian. Alan screwed up his mouth. "You're too naive and reckless, Sebastian. When you've been a professor as long as I have, you understand that the students need a firm and careful hand. The fact that they love you so much should be your warning that your methods are wrong." "I'm sorry you believe that," said Sebastian, putting the car in gear. "Back to the hall." "Back entrance," he said. "I don't want anyone to see me limping in. I plan on heading to my quarters, putting on my favorite slippers, and resting for the day. Maybe by tomorrow the hole will be closed." "What did you do anyway?" "Mending a hole in my shoe, but I said sole, not hole." Sebastian sucked air between his teeth. "Ouch. I bet that wasn't pleasant." After dropping Alan off at the back entrance to Arcanium, he remembered that he hadn't replaced the fish tank. A detour later, and he managed to squeeze into a tropical fish store and grab a 250-gallon tank, since they were out of the one that broke. On his way back, Sebastian saw that the Philosopher's Scone was about to close. The proprietor was spinning the sign and preparing to lock the door, when he grabbed a parking spot and hurried up before she went deeper inside. "Can I help you?" she asked, squinting as she stuck her head out the open door. The wind caught her crimson curls, sending them to flutter around the crown of her head. "Arcanium," he said, touching his chest. "You're alchemists." "Oh, right. The professor. How'd your meeting go? Any battles over the cupcakes?" "Oh wait, you came back," she screwed up her face. "Does that mean they were a problem?" "Oh no," he said, laughing, "quite the contrary. They were a hit, just as I'd like to, sorry." Sebastian felt the heat rise to his cheeks. She opened the door a little wider. "Were you about to say, just as I'd like to hit on you? You have me dead to rights. Sorry about that. I spent the day teaching lexology, and I get a little too used to letting my tongue carry the day." She shifted her mouth to the side once again, then grinned and held out her hand. "I'm Elena." "Sebastian," he replied. "It's nice to learn your name." "Lexology, huh? Shouldn't you have a little tighter control for a practitioner of word spells?" she asked, her tongue playfully resting on her teeth. "That's the beauty and danger of lexology. It's quite flexible, but is known for bringing many a mage through unintended consequences. Why, this morning we had a close one when a fish tank got trapped against the ceiling." "Don't stop there. That sounds like quite an event," said Elena with anticipation. "Oh no," he said, remembering Professor Chopra mentioning his favorite slippers, which had been dunked in fish water. He was certain that Alan would try to reacquire them before resting for the evening. "Oh no. I must get back. I might have been a little too exuberant with my spell this morning." Sebastian started hurrying away when he found Elena by his side. I hope you don't mind, she said, grinning with excitement. This sounds fun. There were rules against bringing outsiders into Arcanium without permission from Patron Gray, even for professors, but he wasn't about to turn her away on the cusp of a potential date. You can't go anywhere else, he said. But I suppose I could use the help. Sebastian let Elena through the hall wards with a brief incantation. They hurried through the hallways. Since it was around dinner time, they were less populated, and those students he did see were too busy studying to notice the outsider. He knew there was a problem when he saw Professor Chopra's classroom door open wide. Skidding to a stop, but not going in, Sebastian found his counterpart cowering in the corner, swinging at floating fish with his chalkboard pointer. You! What have you done to my classroom and my fish? Professor Chopra's eyes widened as Elena came around the corner. And who is that? The floating dream eaters, as if drawn by their voices, started heading into the hallway like tiny blue balloons being blown on a soft breeze. Sebastian raised his hands and sent a wave of wind against the dream eaters, blowing them back into the room. The last thing he needed were the dangerous fish terrorizing the students. As he headed into the room, Elena followed, still looking excited by the danger. Round and down we go. Into the bucket, but do it nice and slow. You'll find the water is easy to breathe. And better than floating on a stiff breeze. The dream eaters rotated in a descending whirlwind, entering the bucket of water with dozens of tiny plops. I'm very sorry, Alan, he said once he knew the danger was over. I didn't think anyone would come back to the classroom. I should have remembered your slippers. A red-faced Alan looked like he was going to explode. I'm going to talk to Patron Gray about this. I can't believe you broke my fish tank, set my dream eaters to ambush me, and brought an outsider into Arcanium. Sebastian's heart dropped into his stomach. He knew the other professors weren't a fan of his, but this could potentially get him kicked out. Teaching at Arcanium was a dream job. Making matters worse, he might be expelled in front of a woman he'd just decided to ask out a short time before. For once his words failed him. He had nothing to say. Elena gave a short little wave, followed by a gentle curtsy as she approached Alan with her palm out. Hi. I run the bakery up the street. You look a little frustrated by these events. Would you like a chocolate? They're really quite divine and might help. To Sebastian's surprise, Alan growled under his breath but then reached out and plopped the treat into his mouth. A few seconds after he started chewing, he mumbled, "This is quite good," and then his eyes went unfocused. What did you do to him? Asked Sebastian. It's a little trick for irate customers. They forget what just happened and go about their day. The chocolate erases the last 15 minutes, so we should probably get his slippers on him and send him out before it wears off. Oh, he said, reaching out as if he were going to hug her, but thought better of it. You're a lifesaver. I'm not going to turn into a piece of hard candy, am I, Mr. Lexology? He laughed. Not today, anyway. A pliant Alan Chopra was helped into his slippers and sent back to his room before he woke up. With Elena's help, he retrieved the fish tank and had it set up a few hours later, returning the dream eaters when it was finished. Back outside Arcanium, Sebastian held out his hand. Thank you so much for your help, Elena. This has been quite an interesting day. I wouldn't have survived it without you. I was coming by to ask you out. Maybe we could do that another time. Elena stepped past his hand and pressed her lips against the corner of his mouth, before quickly pulling away and wagging her eyebrows. Or we could head out to a nightclub, and you could tell me all about that talented tongue of yours. She winked. You know, Lexology. Sebastian held out his arm, which she took, and then headed down the sidewalk. He chuckled lightly under his breath, which brought a question, which he answered with a smile. Earlier today I was explaining to my students that mistakes breed opportunity. Sometimes professors get to learn their own lessons too. This has been a slip of the tongue by Thomas K. Carpenter.